So at the end of June 2026, Nintendo held their annual general meeting for the 2025 to 2026 fiscal year. And a couple of weeks later, we now have their annual report published. Now, the annual reports aren't documents which should be massively surprising. Really, you want to be flagging up to investors any problems way ahead of the annual report coming out, and a lot of it is fairly standardized stuff. But all the same, I do think it's interesting. However, just because it's been so chaotic lately, I thought I'd try a different tack with reviewing it this year. And I'm just going to go through and we're going to have a look at it. I'm going to talk through it as we go as an unscripted video, just highlight any things that are of interest as we go through. So let's just have a look and see what we have. So we have the table of contents, obviously just showing the extent of the report. We're not going to read through everything because there's an awful lot here. A lot of this very, very standard stuff. So this is just information that they need to have for the Tokyo Stock Exchange and general information. I do like this first table because unlike a lot of the quarterly reports, it gives a little bit more of a historical context where we can see the previous fiscal years at Nintendo, and they refer to them as the 86th, 85th, and so on fiscal years. These are the years they've been in operation as a company in that form, but obviously for the 86th one, we're talking about April 2025 through to March 2026. And you can see, obviously, the net sales are very, very high in terms of yen. That's clearly because the Switch 2 has a higher selling point. But in terms of the actual profit, the operating profit, it's considerably less than it was a few years ago. Now, that's made up once you take into account the ordinary profit. That's things like all the investment returns and such like, which brings it up. And that's because I think they hedged quite significantly during the 2024-ish period. You can see an actual dip there in terms of their ordinary profit, just in anticipation of needing to make sure that they had a healthy launch to the Switch 2 era, and that if it was a bumpy ride, that they could get through most things. And I think that's basically what's happened. Also of note, some things here, their capital adequacy ratio, obviously 70% is incredibly high, but to get up to 80 recently is great. They're now back to 77.63, but they're still in a very good position. And that's bearing in mind that they have some pretty major investments at the moment, big spending projects. They've got that massive new building that they're developing. So one would assume that once that is put into place, they may even find that their capital adequacy percentage increases still further. And we've got cash flows from operating activities, investing activities. And again, you can see, big ups and downs here as they've been making particular changes. And then cash flows from financing activities here as well. So, all things considered, it's been a bit of a tumultuous last couple of years as they've tried to get ready for Switch 2, but all things considered, they're really on fire. Number of employees, well, it's gone up consistently. I'm not entirely clear if this incorporates all of these subsidiaries, but obviously that would include acquisitions such as Nintendo Studios Singapore, the new group they bought from Bandai Namco. Although having said that, I think the effective date of that might have been, I should have checked that, I think it might be with effect from the new financial year. Even though it was announced in November, I'm not sure they are yet, as of this report, part of Nintendo. So that's probably not incorporated here. And if we look at the overview of the different groups coming up, I don't think we will see the Singapore group here. I'm not going to flag up this too much. Obviously, November 1947 was when they were established, paying with Western playing cards, and you can see the history, but this is really a history of Nintendo on the Tokyo Stock Exchange rather than particularly a history of Nintendo more broadly. So it's interesting, but not really for a fan perspective, I would have said, more for someone looking at the investor side of things, which is, of course, what this report is for. Description of the business is also quite fun. They haven't really changed this from year to year. It's the same kind of basic concept. So they do mention things like movies, videos, and mobile applications as utilizing their business IP. That's probably one of the more significant additions in relatively recent times. They do note that they have 32 subsidiaries and 4 associates as of March the 31st, 2026. Well, that is different from last year. Last year they had 29 subsidiaries and they had 5 associates. Now, obviously, there have been some changes during this fiscal year. So there was the full ownership of Monolith Soft, which took place in late 2024. That would have been in the 24 to 25 fiscal year. But again, I'm not quite sure what the effective date of that was, so it might be relevant mainly to this report. Then there was Warp Star, which was the Kirby merchandise and promotion studio, which is now becoming Nintendo Stars, a general purpose talent studio. So that's obviously one change. They've been fully bought out by Nintendo, and so it's a completely in-house deal. We'll have a look through the list of subsidiaries in a second. There's a short list here as well. But there are some which are not named, and that will be something that I do want to try and track down. I've done more videos on some of the associates before, but for this video, I'm just going to do a sort of general summary. If anyone does have any ideas about some of the unnamed Nintendo subsidiaries, Nintendo's secret subsidiaries, dare I say, then do let me know. We should have a list of them. Yeah, here we are. We've got a list of them here. And you can see percentage of voting rights held by the company. It's pretty much 100, 100, 100, 100 now, because in years gone by, they had quite a lot of partnerships, quite a lot of arrangements where they had large percentages, but not 100. Clearly, ND Cube, they've got, well, it's Nintendo Cube, but they had 99%. Not quite sure if that's still Dentsu, if that's someone else. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they are, to all intents and purposes, a fully owned part of Nintendo. And the same is now true with Monolith Software. The only one really that is yet to be fully bought out is Nintendo Systems. That was a partnership with the Japanese mobile and telecoms giant DeNA, and so DeNA still own 20% of it, and my guess is that until or unless it suits DeNA to divest themselves, they'll probably continue there, but at some point there probably will be some kind of divergence, and that too will become a full part of Nintendo. It took a very long time for that change to take place with ND Cube, with it becoming Nintendo Cube, but Nintendo does have a lot of spare capital sloshing around at the moment, so it's the kind of thing they might want to do while the sun is shining. Here we have the name of some of their different companies, different subsidiaries. Got the America, Europe, the sales. Nintendo Sales, by the way, that is a Japanese-based company. In about 2016, they bought out JESNet, and I think that was a Japanese-based sales logistic operation. There is a Nintendo Sales website. If you go back to around 2024, I deep dived them, and you can see lots of stuff about them. But it's not yet, as far as I know, a worldwide sales operation, although obviously that is something that they will probably look to do in due course. Now, they do notice here there are 8 other consolidated subsidiaries not listed above. The one that I don't think should be on here, but could be one of the missing ones, is the Nintendo Singapore branch, but my guess is that that will be founded with effect from the 1st of April, just because we've got Nintendo of Korea, of Australia, and so on. But having said that, it might not have reached the size threshold for them to consider it worth mentioning on here. In terms of the associates, there are 2 associates accounted for using the equity method other than the one shown above. Now, again, I've covered that other time, so we will move on for the time being. Business overviews, well, we've got the same kind of basic stuff that we have expected to see. There used to be a section specifically on employees around now, and that seems to have vanished, which is a shame. We did have a general summary of the number of employees, and I think there might be some information which appears a little bit further on. We've got approaches to initiatives for sustainability. A lot of this is kind of obligatory legal stuff that they've got to cover under the particular laws and guidance for companies on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. We've got the board of directors now reporting, and with sort of oversight going between the president and representative director. What's interesting is previously it was clear that the board of directors had, that reporting oversight line directly went back and forth with the senior general manager and division. It suggests that there's now the president and a representative director, the executive management committee. They kind of run a go-between between the board of directors and the rest of the company. I'm not entirely sure why they have done that, except I guess it streamlines things. It certainly must make things easier for Furukawa, I would have thought. But whether that creates any particular issues, I'm not sure. But there does seem to be some kind of internal rejig. Perhaps a part of it is that the senior general manager of General Affairs Division of Nintendo Company Limited. Well, a lot of those people would be people like Shina Takahashi, who would be the director in charge of EPD, and obviously Beppu and other people who are key figures. So I guess perhaps they just think it's smoother, given they've already got directors there, that the board of directors are informed through the executive management committee. They've also changed some of the names. They had to CSR, so corporate social responsibility, I assume, was what we had previously. Now it's the sustainability promotion team, but I don't imagine that this is anything more than a superficial rejig of the way they operate. Strategy, again, these kind of strategy deliberations are pretty standard. There's nothing enormously drastic. There is a slight edit here this year. So they've already said, we provide high quality products that are both safe and entertaining. We ensure customers of all age can enjoy Nintendo's game software and services with peace of mind, so strive to prioritize safety in game software development, create features that enable parents and guardians to check children's usage, and eliminate inappropriate content and communications features, among other initiatives. Now, that was what they had last year. They have also added in something new here, which is when consumers provide us with information, we clearly specify how we will use consumer information, such as in our privacy policy, and strictly handle this information in adherence with internal regulations. In addition, we revise and enhance our internal structure in compliance with the laws and standards related to the handling of information. So again, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on with this. It might just be that they've decided to tighten their internal processes, but it might equally be that in some country in the world, there's been a particular law that's come into effect, which has meant they've had to rejig this, and so they want it for belt and braces in their annual report so they can show the importance of it. Most of this is pretty much the same. Again, we've got the employees. The employee section has been booted off to a separate part. Then we've got some details about the environment, which is the same sort of stuff that they've had before. Nothing drastically surprising. Then we have risk management in general. The sustainability coordination team meets with the sustainability teams that are subsidiaries outside Japan to exchange ideas to designate sustainability priorities. So a lot of this is the kind of corporate bureaucracy stuff that you would expect of any large company, really. And then, of course, we've got what company would be complete without some metrics. Now, in the past, they had specific ones that they talked about them focusing on. So things like the rate of childcare leave taken among female employees and the rate of childcare leave taken among male employees. My guess is that was probably linked to specific areas of interest from the Japanese government, because obviously legislation will dictate the kinds of things that need to appear in this. Here they have done a more bare bones response, but they're just saying, because we deal with entertainment products and content that naturally hold many uncertainties in terms of business operations, we have not set any specific management index targets. And, to be honest, that's fair enough, really, considering the nature of what they are doing. Risk factors. Now, the risk factors are really age-old. They don't change significantly. Obviously, there are individual things that are risks, but the fundamental order remains the same. The economic environment obviously is going to have a huge impact on Nintendo, and foreign exchange rates in particular. The actual wording isn't any different from before. It's just the same kind of concept, which is that if the Japanese yen is very strong, then that has advantages and it has disadvantages. But at the moment, the Japanese yen is pretty weak by historical standards, and that means that it's very good for all the amounts of money that Nintendo are raising by selling their consoles in the West, but maybe it's not so good in terms of funding American studios or doing projects which work abroad, doing manufacturing abroad. But they've obviously worked their way around this. I think the biggest risk period was that period of time where they were trying to boot up a new console. Very expensive to do that if there were abrupt foreign exchange rate changes. And so I think you can see with the amount of investment activity that we highlighted earlier, that was obviously meant to cushion that potential blow. We've got other risks, which is the fluctuation of the market environment and the competition with other companies. I mean, again, there's nothing too drastically different here. If anything, they've kind of simplified it down. It says Nintendo is dedicated to thoroughly refining each product and service. By working to help foster an enduring fondness for Nintendo's characters and worlds, it hopes to become a beloved part of people's lives across generations and create more reasons to choose Nintendo for unique, family-friendly entertainment. Now, I think this pivot towards the idea of being truly intergenerational is relatively new, and I think it probably symbolizes a subtle shift which is starting to be rolled out with this investor report, which I think we will see more of, into a period where Nintendo is growing quite rapidly to a period where Nintendo is trying to frame its activities as having an intergenerational focus. And the reason for that is, A, because it is fundamentally true. Nintendo is looking to build up relationships with its customers, which are essentially lifelong. They really do want the little children to be having discussions with Granddad about, oh yes, I remember playing The Legend of Zelda when I was 10, and now you're playing Tears of the Kingdom, or whatever it might be. So I think they like that idea of continuity. I think it's a great sales technique for them as well, because it puts it at the heart of the home. In the Q&A I covered the other day, both Miyamoto and Furukawa used the same metaphor of sowing seeds, and the idea that in their activities in China and India, maybe these wouldn't lead to mega sales on day one or year one or even year 5, but they would be sowing seeds for the future, that the people who discover Nintendo would eventually feel like, oh, this is quite an interesting company, and perhaps this is something that I'll remember when I have children. And so gradually over time, that association with Nintendo would grow. I think this is something that we're going to see a lot more of from Nintendo. Part of it is just there's an element of spin, obviously, because they're not going to grow at the same pace that they have done. The Switch period came off the back of some real doldrums, so just the fact that the Switch wasn't a complete failure was massive for them. Then you had Pokemon Go around 2016, right before the Switch. That accelerated things as well. Then you had the pandemic and Animal Crossing, and then you had the film, and so you had this real surge of Nintendo success. And that's not to say that they won't continue to have success in the future. There has been a bit of a dip in the stock price, but of course a lot of that is because whenever there's new hardware, there's a bit of a bubble around it. I think I've highlighted in previous videos the way that's gone before, so it's not a terrible surprise that there was a bit of a dip and a pullback, especially given some of the context in the market at the moment. But I don't think that's a particular concern for Nintendo. I think what they need to look at is the fact that they are building something that is cross-generational, and that flows through to a lot of their different activities. We also have development of new products. Now, this isn't actually new at all, but it is quite interesting. So despite the substantial costs and time needed for the planning and development of software for dedicated video game platforms, applications for smart device, gaming services, and movies and videos, there is no guarantee that all new products and services will be accepted by consumers due to ever-shifting preferences. Now, of course, last year, that had a particular sort of sense of foreboding, because it was like, well, will the Switch 2 be adopted, or will people reject it? But this year they can be a lot more confident, but they still have this note in there because ultimately the Switch 2 may trail off, or some of their future innovations might not quite work. So it says, as development of hardware is time-consuming with technology continuously advancing, Nintendo may not be able to readily acquire technologies required for entertainment. Obviously, we're talking about risks here, remember, so these are things that could be big risks. Furthermore, delays of product launches could adversely affect market share. Not saying that there were any delays of product launches, just that that is theoretically something which could be something that impacts their market share. In addition, due to the nature of Nintendo products and services, it may be difficult to develop products and services as planned in some cases, making it impossible to sell or launch the products and services as planned. Moreover, development may be suspended or aborted, and the original plan could differ to a large extent. In the field of entertainment, the development process is complicated and includes many uncertainties. Therefore, if Nintendo is unable to deal with the above risks, its financial position, operating results, and cash flows could be adversely affected. Nintendo continuously strives to develop unique and attractive new products. So obviously there is a risk whenever you're doing something innovative that those things might not take. And I think you can probably imagine as you read through this, lots of different potential examples of games, even quite recent ones and ones going back in time, where there have been delays or there have been reboots or there have been things that haven't sold properly or things that haven't taken on the market. So it's natural that this is relatively high. It's not as big as the economic areas or the fluctuating market conditions, but it's a pretty big, it's got a pretty big burden on their business. And then product valuation and adequate inventory procurement, dependency on outside manufacturers, which obviously Nintendo particularly has at the moment with the large number of products they're producing for the Switch 2. In addition, suppliers may be unable to provide necessary components on a timely basis. Well, yeah, that's something that is a particular concern at the moment. And actually, they have slightly... no, they haven't, I beg your pardon. I don't think they've changed that too much. I think they've just added a little bit in to say, here, furthermore, many suppliers' production facilities are located in the area outside Japan. No, I think that's the same as it was before. Can't see any major differences. Business operations affected by seasonal fluctuation. End of year sales season, New Year season, etc. Obviously Christmas in the West. Should Nintendo fail to release attractive new products or supply products on time during that period, operating performance could be adversely affected. Then we've got system issues, cyber attacks, other things, various factors affecting business globally, political, economic factors, disadvantages from inconsistency of multilateral taxation systems and diversity of tax law interpretation, difficulty in recruiting and securing human resources, labour disputes, strikes, social disruption resulting from terror attacks, war, and other catastrophic events. So you can see we're getting down into some of the weeds of different things that could happen. But obviously, Nintendo needs to set out to its investors all the ways that all this could go wrong and all the things that could hurt them. And these will be the things where they're taking some considerable amount of time and effort to try to keep things on an even keel. But as I say, this isn't unique to this year. These are things that Nintendo have in their report every year because they're the standing basic things that Nintendo need to worry about and deal with. Then the analysis of the financial position. Again, not significant changes in the overall, but there are some in the specific details of the examples that they give. So when there's a description and analysis of the results, they highlight obviously different games. So Pokemon Pocopia was a factor in driving further hardware sales towards the end of the fiscal year, helping sales volume reach 19.86 million units for the full term. And looking at software, Mario Kart World, which was released on the same day as the hardware, sold 14.7 million units, including bundle sales. And then we've got details for Donkey Kong Bonanza. Sadly, we don't have any further details than we've had before, and so we don't know anything about Metroid Prime 4. We've got IP details. I mean, all these are the kinds of things that you would have seen me go through with their quarterly investment reports. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time going into them. It's really just a kind of headline summary for people who just need a quick read through and maybe possibly didn't look at all the presentations or weren't at the presentations previously in order to know exactly what's going on. But you can see there's a lot of different things that they cover. Let's go down to factors which have a significant impact on operating results. And again, it's the same kind of thing. There's nothing new here particularly, but it's interesting. More than 70% of Nintendo's total sales are generated in markets outside of Japan, with most transactions carried out in local currencies. And so this is where that element of currency exchange does remain something that Nintendo constantly needs to consider and bear in mind and hedge around and manage. But that's true every year, not just this one. The current ratio here is 396%. That's the ratio of total liabilities to cash and cash equivalent being 1.5 times. So previously it was a little bit different, but we're basically in the same sort of ballpark where Nintendo is very, very, very healthy. Material contracts, etc., not applicable. Research and development activities. Again, there's nothing massively new here. I think it's interesting to see what they say they're working on, because obviously they've got to be honest with their investors. They can keep some corporate secrets to a certain degree, but they can't be completely evasive about the kinds of things that they're developing. And so they've got vague overall summaries of the kinds of things they're doing. But, it's quite interesting to see. We've got wireless communication, security, cloud computing, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, deep learning, and big data analysis. Our efforts are not limited to in-house studios and research, and we are exploring various possibilities on a daily basis to discover technologies that will help create new ways to play by proactively turning our attention outside Nintendo. I doubt that has any specific thing in mind, but it might do. I did highlight a couple of years ago something about lifestyle, which disappeared from one year to the next, and I suspect that was because it was put in anticipation of the Alamo clock, and so perhaps there is something else there. If you're one of these people that believes that Nintendo is still interested in doing some kind of thing in virtual reality, and I do think there is the potential of more VR, AR, MR stuff from them, although exactly how that will work, I'm not sure. Clearly, we've already got the Virtual Boy headset and adapter, so they could probably do something at relatively low cost, but they might equally do something a bit more ambitious. Well, there's certainly evidence here that it's something they're looking at, but whether or not it leads anywhere, we'll have to wait and see. They've strongly driven the expansion of each system infrastructure with the Nintendo eShop. Research and development expenses for this year were up 177.8 billion yen, which is up from 143-ish last year. And then there's a list of some of the games that they produced this year. Again, it's obviously slightly adapted because there's different things. They mentioned the Talking Flower, but there's nothing drastically different at this point. So I think we can kind of assume that by and large, things are on a pretty even keel. Equipment and facilities, we've got their various different plants they've got. Again, nothing drastically changed. We will eventually have a lot more coming up with the building of this completely new area. But for now, they've got their branch offices. You can see that there's a bit less being spent now on machinery, equipment, and vehicles for the Nintendo Museum. Now that is pretty much set up. It was about 34 million last year. They have spent a lot more on machinery, equipment, and vehicles for their corporate headquarters, but then they're also redeveloping that. So I guess that's probably what's going on there. And you can see the distribution of their employees. They've got 2,743 people at their main Kyoto offices. Principal place of business. There's a few different places here. And we can see what those are. So, and a few other bits to see. Plans for new installation, retirement of equipment and facilities. So again, this is just a summary of what we've talked about previously. There's going to be renovation of previous buildings, and then the building here of the Technology Development Center. So you can see that Nintendo Company Limited and its consolidated subsidiaries will have constant renovation, production facilities, but these are kind of standard things, I guess. It probably covers general building maintenance. There's no particular evidence that they're doing some major significant work with any of them, but I'm sure there's lots of stuff that they will continue to do year to year. I'm sure it involves changing the light bulbs and a lot more besides, but it's not as exciting as this big new building, the Technology Development Center. That will be a major step up in Nintendo's capabilities, and my guess is, I've mentioned this a few times, but I think probably it will be the juncture at which we will see quite a major rejig of the way Nintendo organizes its internal groups, just like we did in 2015 when Shinya Takahashi took over from Shigeru Miyamoto in charge of EPD, or actually renaming it to EPD from EAD. Profile of the company. So we've got obviously details of the shares and such like. Nothing too dramatic here unless you're a shareholder. Trends of the number of shares issued. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think there is this section I quite like, which is the status of the major shareholders, but actually the number of shares held isn't drastically different. So the Master Trust Bank of Japan has divested itself of about 100,000 shares, which is not that much in the scheme of things. It's still over 16%. And there's a few different arrangements here, but you'll notice that actually there are multiple issues. So there's a few JP Morgans. There's JP Morgan down there. There's JP Morgan up here. So there's different groups that are invested, different funds going on there. So obviously lots of different people have an element of Nintendo. These are the major, institutional investors. And we have a few other shareholders listed as well. Also BlackRock there. Voting rights and other bits and pieces, again, due to the link to the shares. Acquire of treasury stock, again, it's all share stuff, which I'm not going to focus on too much because ultimately we're not looking at this particularly through an investor lens. Apologies, because I know there are people who watch this video who are investors. Dividend policy, again, I've covered dividends in previous videos to a more detailed extent. The corporate governance system, so that's changed a little bit, as I said, and they've just got an outline of exactly how it works. It's basically, well, you can have a look at this lovely flowchart, which actually I don't think is particularly different from previous years. I think they've just streamlined it for the sake of their sustainability goals, but you can see that we've got internal auditing, we've got the Executive Management Committee, we've got directors, we've got lots of divisions, department offices, subsidiaries. There's a lot going on, but that's the kind of thing you see with the governance of a large multinational company. Board of directors, 14 directors, including 5 who are audit and supervisory committee members. We've got various board members here and so on. We can see the history from the past financial year of the number of meetings that all these various people have been at. And these are the directors in question. Obviously, one of the directors was appointed later, so they could only be in 10 meetings as opposed to 12, which clearly was a bit of a difference. And then we've got more things about compliance. So we've got committee chairperson Kentaro Yamagichi is responsible for that. We know exactly what each of these people are responsible for. There are other matters related to corporate governance, so preparedness, I should say, of the risk management system. Well, we've talked about the risks earlier on, so naturally a big part of what they're doing is ensuring that they are ready for all the contingencies, but this is all fairly standard stuff. Again, I'm not going to really cover it in detail just because there's nothing actually that new. Most of this stuff is going to be standard from year to year, and I don't think there's a particular cause for change at this point in time. So if we scroll down, basic policy regarding the company's control, the company's board of directors believes the decision of whether to accept another party's tender or acquisition offer for the purpose of making large purchase of company stock ultimately should be entrusted to its shareholders, given the stock of the company, which is a public company, is freely traded. However, it is likely that certain tender or acquisition offers may harm the company's corporate value or the common interest of shareholders, depending on the intent of the offer. The company's board of directors maintains that such tender or acquisition offers are inappropriate. So basically it's saying don't try and buy us out. Okay, and then we get to the board of directors. So again, we've got Shuntaro Furukawa, and we've got a bit about his history at the Pokemon Company and so on. We know Miyamoto is obviously a key figure of the company. Shinya Takahashi has been there, and obviously the highlights in his CV are from the corporate perspective. They haven't included him directing Wave Race, but that's a pretty big event in his Nintendo history. And then we've got Satoru Shibata. Obviously this year, big development. He is now the CEO of Nintendo of America Incorporated. By the way, these are the number of shares that each of these holds. You can see that while Furukawa himself has quite a number of shares, that's 100, so 18,000 shares. The rest of these people have a little bit less, but still quite a number. We've got Yusuke Beppo, who was appointed as a director in June 2024. And is a pretty significant person with Nintendo Network Services and other things in the past. I have covered him way back, in fact, during 2024 when he was appointed. And then we've got Chris Maledondri. Obviously, In his case, he's a more recent addition to the board, but he's from Illumination, so that gives them an element of contact there. And we've got a few of their new people on the board as well. I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but again, I have past videos if you'd like to look through them. Then we have some ideas of some of the titles of the key people, the executive officers, the senior executives. Yet again, I do have videos going back over who these various people are. Devon Pritchard is obviously the biggest new name here this year as the new executive officer and the president of Nintendo of America Inc. And my guess is over time she may even rise to become a senior executive officer in the company, depending on how long she stays. Clearly, Reggie and Doug Bowser didn't wait till 65 to retire. I'm not quite sure how old Doug Bowser was, but I didn't get the impression he waited right until the last moment to put in his resignation. And also the other year we had Luciano Perino Lopez joining as the executive officer for Nintendo of Europe. Then we've got the outside officers. Again, I'll talk through all these people separately. Not much to add. There is a particular section here about Chris Meledandri, and it just says, we're influenced by his intentions. However, the movie and video game content business is becoming an increasingly important part of our efforts, and so we need to align his knowledge, basically. And then there's details of how everything is audited, the status of those audits with the various meetings and the directors who are responsible for it, not stuff that's going to immediately impact what we are doing, compensation for the audits, which is all interesting, but not dramatically affecting Nintendo's outcome. And there's that business I mentioned a little while ago in terms of the amount of points, and in this case points do mean prizes because points relate to the amount of money that can be offered as compensation, and so you can see there are points awarded for different groups for different reasons, and that would potentially allow them greater compensation in alignment with the way they've rejigged their compensation policy for this year. And if we go down, I think we will see, not here, total amount of compensation. So you can see the performance-based compensation. This is in millions of yen, but you can see who's compensated how, but I did cover this in a previous video. They only need to report people who are on a certain level, so that's over a certain number of millions of yen, or in this case we can see over $1 million. So there are 4 people paid $1 million plus at Nintendo, and only those 4, inflation being what it is. Perhaps in years to come we will see who are number 5, 6 and 7, but for the time being it's these 4 amigos: Furukawa, Miyamoto, Takahashi is the head of EPT, and Shibata in charge of lots of different things, but not least Nintendo of America, which is probably the group of people you might expect to be the most well remunerated at the company. We can also see some of the compensation for some of the other people in that section there. A bit more on stocks. This is one that I find particularly interesting to look at. These are the people that Nintendo are invested in and the reasons for it, usually as part of developing a stable business relationship because they develop software for the company's platforms. And actually there haven't been any changes at all as far as I can see this year. So the only differences that I can note are that if we look down to Square Enix, it appears by the numbers that Nintendo acquired a lot more shares this year, but it turns out that that's just due to a share split. So it's not like there's any major significant change. Nintendo have been pretty cautious about making any major changes. They obviously have ongoing relationships with a lot of these places. So Bandai Namco particularly, we can see Konami, Square Enix, Koei Tecmo. So, 4 very substantial, long in the tooth Japanese game developers with whom Nintendo have quite long relationships. And so it's quite natural that, there is some kind of level of investment there. And we've got a few other places. So TV Tokyo, shares are held there for maintaining that stable business relationship, which includes the broadcasting of television programs. But as I say, none of this is new, so I doubt it relates to any immediate plans of theirs. This is just the kind of companies that they have invested in over the years. Then we've got our more detailed employee section. And I think what's probably new here, and that is probably the thing that bears the biggest scrutiny, is this business on Nintendo's DNA, which seems to be the biggest new thing that they are trying to focus on. Note that both Furukawa and Miyamoto were going quite big in the Q&A on Nintendo DNA. So what do we mean by Nintendo DNA? Well, they're saying they've got human resource initiatives designed to maximize the individual development of each employee through their work experience. And they want to make sure that, it's not all on one person. They're emphasizing teamwork. And so these three elements they're focusing on. So originality. Nintendo's purpose is to continue delivering new entertainment and new experiences. We place great value on providing consumers with original products and services that surprise them by being different. We are passionate about this goal and will continue to take on new challenges. Then flexibility. In order to sustain prosperity, we must respond dynamically to an ever-changing environment. Our decisions change when the conditions and business environment changes. We must be nimble and flexible to adapt to changes by thinking outside the box and not simply follow what has worked in the past. And then sincerity. The accumulation of small but trustworthy actions over time can lead to great change. We need humility and must never forget to be modest and always put our best foot forward. In order to develop, we try to learn from our experiences each day. Now, obviously, a lot of people who've worked in any kind of business environment or any kind of environment which has a corporate aspect, a school or hospital or whatever it might be, will probably have come across these kinds of, corporate sets of values. There is a potential benefit to them if there is a sense of clarity. I think in particular having originality at the heart is very important. And I wonder whether the likelihood that there will be quite a significant change in the top personnel at Nintendo's video game development cohort over the next 10 years, if it hasn't been already, is kind of focusing them in on that. Miyamoto in particular, yes, he's still very active, still seems to be involved in lots of stuff, but he is in his late 70s. There will come a time when he is not able to be involved as much. And so if you can't embody that kind of thing within people, then you have to try to embody it with a more abstract set of values. And that is difficult. I think historically, the way a company like Nintendo has worked, the way that those Kyoto companies have worked, is that you would have much more of a sense of mentorship. And if you go back to that video I did the other day on the retirement process at Nintendo, you can see the way they've structured everything in order to allow for a long potential period of wind down of those senior people where they can really focus on mentoring and not necessarily on the day-to-day. From the age of about 50 through to 65 and possibly to 70, they will be potentially anticipating ahead when they are no longer with the company. And that's quite a big chunk of time. They might have spent 25 to 30 years at the company, and now they're going to spend potentially another 15 or 20 winding down. So quite a big change, but it's always going to be tricky if you're trying to embed these rules when the company is growing fast, when perhaps some of those senior people are moving on a bit faster than there are people with deep experience to replace them. And so putting originality at the heart of it probably is quite a good reminder. It also makes me wonder whether if Furukawa, who up until now, his regime has been quite stable, quite consistent, and I don't think that's necessarily just because that's him, although I think it probably is him to a large degree. I think that is his nature, his personality, but I also think it's just a fluke of the time at which he's taken Nintendo on, when a lot of things came together right after the end of Iwata's premiership, really, with the Nintendo Switch, and so they've been able to move towards a slightly safer, more stable, iterative period of their history, really, where they're not as reliant on the kind of big swings that Iwata took. I do think part of that was just Iwata's personality, but equally, I think if you don't have something that's struggling like some of their past consoles were, you don't need to reach out as much. If you look at the NES to the SNES, Yes, there are changes, but they weren't that drastic. The N64, the changes were largely enforced by the technological environment. At the end of the Wii sales dropped off a cliff late on, and so naturally they had to think of something different. The Game Boy Advance was quite long in the tooth, and that had been quite iterative until they really shook things up with the DS. But by the time of the 3DS, they really did need something different because the iPhone had come out, and already the touchscreen idea was starting to seem a little bit dated, and obviously 3D was quite dated almost as soon as it came out. I remember there being a huge fuss about 3D films in around 2010, 2009. I never quite saw the appeal myself, and I think most people got bored of it quite quickly. But obviously, by that point, the 3DS was well into development. So yeah, and on Sincerity as well, it'll be interesting to see how that comes through, because you know, in the mass YouTube media out there, things go in big swings. We've had a year and a bit where Nintendo has been the great enemy of the people, where they've been these terrible individuals who are gouging prices and whatnot, and you know, there's a case to be made for that. But then we flip over and suddenly Nintendo are the great heroes who are not like Sony, axing physical games, although of course they may do in the future. And so I think that outside perspective doesn't really take into account the fact that Nintendo operates by their own standards and for their own reasons, and they will do things that other people feel is unethical if they feel that it's what is needed for their business. I think generally speaking, they try to do right by their own lights. There are certainly times where I would say they haven't, but personally, I think they're relatively few and far between. I do talk about one. I've got a Mario Kart Tour video, which may or may not be up by the time this is recorded. There's just so much going on at the moment that I've taken the day to record a whole bunch of videos around all the current news, so you'll be seeing those over the current week or so. But generally speaking, I think Nintendo do aim for sincerity. Now, what does that look like to them? We need humility and must never forget to be modest and always put our best foot forward. Is that really a message to people on the outside, or is that really a message to staff to say, yeah, you did really well, but you got to be modest? Breath of the Wild was a tremendous success, right? Be modest. That pay rise, you might not get it, because you've got to always put your best foot forward, and in order to develop, you need to try to learn from your experiences every day. So is there an element of that being a man management strategy or woman management strategy, as well as being something for outside? I'm not necessarily sure that that what we would consider small but trustworthy actions are necessarily the things Nintendo are thinking about here. Having said that, I think they do have a sense that they're trying to do right by their customers. I think, in a weird way, this business about the $80 Mario Kart, they really didn't need to do that, because they could just have said, look, it's just bundled in with the system and it's $50 and the other one's going to be $70. It's not going to make that much of a difference. And then if later they raise the price, they raise the price, but it wouldn't make that much of a difference later on. But I think they kind of recognize, look, it's going to be important. They're going to have an $80 price tag for later games. $80 is, in real terms, the same as the kind of price point they've had for a very, very, very long time now. So I think they've thought, let's be transparent up front and let's just put this as the price. And yes, objectively, people look at that and go, well, this is just terrible because there's a price rise. I just think from Nintendo's point of view, I think they would interpret it as just being upfront and direct. So, you know, you can have different perspectives on what sincerity means, is kind of what I'm getting at. Anyway, let's move on. Individual development. Each person can learn a great deal from their work experience. Based on this belief, we help our employees grow not only through the development of their individual skills, but also through the accumulation of experience working with their seniors, supervisors, colleagues, and team members. Again, that's seniors and supervisors. We've talked a lot about that recently. For individual development, it's important that employees have opportunities to broaden their experiences while living the Nintendo DNA and daily work. We've always pursued new forms of fun and excitement, and this attitude has created opportunities to take on challenges. As long as we continue to pursue that fun and excitement, we believe that we can provide opportunities for each employee to grow through challenge. So it's a bit vague and a bit corporate. We know that there have been times when Nintendo have done things. So I've got a video way back, I don't think it's finished yet, on Koizumi, which talks about the development of some of those games, where they would go and experience particular things and see horses and see different things going on to get a sense of how to actually put these into the real world. So it is important that they actually, touch grass, as they say, but I'm not quite sure what they're getting at here. Various other policies for enhancing the workplace environments, metrics and targets. This is one of those standard corporate things where they have a survey and hope that it matches up with what they're looking for. The true purpose of the survey is to obtain candid responses from employees. At this stage, we do not use survey scores as an indicator to avoid creating unnecessary bias in responses caused by employees becoming conspicuous of achieving a target. In addition, since our indicators are designed independently based on our corporate culture, we believe they cannot be simply compared numerically with those of other companies and do not directly provide an accurate assessment of corporate value. Our objective is to rigorously analyse the results internally and make improvements suited to each division and department, and we operate the survey appropriately in line with that purpose. So they had a 90% or plus survey response rate, 91%. They were aiming for 90% plus. We've got 8,666 employees as of the end of March this year. Average age 40.5, average length of service 14.6 years. I think that might be very, very slightly down, but I mean it's it's a very, very long time for anybody to be at a company anyway, and that includes the fact they've had a lot of new people joining recently. It's constantly we're seeing new people joining in. The year-on-year increase or decrease in the average annual salary is 1.64%, which I don't know the inflation figure in Japan off the top of my head, but my guess is it's a broadly inflationary rate. There was some talk about Nintendo having a 10% increase in the salary. They did this a few years ago, and of course Furukawa related this in the Q&A as an example of something great that the company has done, but I don't think they would do this all the time. And I believe there was some kind of Japanese government, not pressure exactly, but discussion with some of their senior corporate leaders to try to encourage certain changes in the economy at that point. So I'm not sure it was completely off Nintendo's own back. We've also got the rate of childcare leave taken among male workers, that's 82%, among all workers, 72%, and so on. The proportion of management positions held by female workers is 5.8%, which is just a rounding error's difference. So my guess is that's probably more to do with different numbers of managers, although does that include people like Risa Tabata almost certainly taking over from Kensuke Tanabe? Difficult to say for sure. She might not be credited in that same way as a manager. I'm not entirely sure how it would work with Nintendo's management structure. We've got the consolidated subsidiaries there, and we've got some details about the number of people, quite a lot of part-time and temporary workers, and there is a fairly significant pay gap there between the male and the female workers. Difficult to really interpret too much of this because, of course, if most of the very senior developers are male, that might naturally lead to there being quite a disparity. I guess it'd be interesting to see a team like the Animal Crossing team, where Goku has been there for quite a long time and in theory should be one of the most highly remunerated, but obviously Nintendo are never going to want to give that kind of detail. This is just what they need to do to hit their compliance obligations. And then we've got the consolidated financial statements. I think we've kind of seen the gist of this already with previous talk-throughs. Then we've got the consolidated statements of change in equity. Again, I'm not going to go through this too much. I think we're pretty much coming to the end of the most interesting parts of the statement. There's a few bits about technical requirements, but I believe we're kind of mostly all the way through. What was that again? I just went past that. Accounting procedures, obviously IQ, and one on subsidiary close accounts on the 31st of December every year, which in theory, I can't think, it might be Taiwan. It might be that we could identify the location, at least, of one of these other subsidiaries by the fact that it closes on the 31st of December. But my guess is it's Nintendo of Taiwan that they're thinking of there. I couldn't say for sure. Just skipping down because there's a lot of just scrolling past. So segment information. Here we've got some information about the sales by geographic area. Again, this isn't new, but it is interesting. And also property, plant, and equipment. Now, this is in millions of yen. What I find interesting here is that we know that there is a vast number of people and property and equipment in Japan. But even though they have to accommodate all these people, if you look at the ratio, there's a lot of money spent on property, plant, and equipment in America. And a lot of that obviously reflects the different property prices in the US as opposed to Japan. And they do increasingly have quite a number of departments there. They've got retro, they've got Nintendo technology, they've got Nintendo software technology, they've got Shiver, they've got, it says the US, but I don't know necessarily whether it incorporates the broader Americas. It could include Next Level Games as well, I guess. But there's still quite a lot there. But it's interesting to see that actually it's pretty expensive for Nintendo to run even the operation they do in America compared to Japan. I'm not sure what the price of all this stuff per person is, but it must be quite high on top of obviously the amount that they've got to pay for wages and such like. Sales information by third parties, more on geographic data. And then we've got information about related parties and transaction details. So the disposal of treasury shares in exchange for in-kind contribution of monetary compensation claims. So these were things that Furukawa has done over recent years. But I mean, I'm not going to get into the individual ins and outs of different bits and pieces here. I think by and large, this is probably the end of the video. I'm just going to have a quick skim down to see if there's anything else that we need to incorporate. So there's the address if you want to get hold of them. But no, I think we've pretty much covered everything that's there that's interesting. I hope it's been interesting for people reading through. Obviously it's a relatively dry topic, but I think it's quite fun to just see where Nintendo is at and what's going on. And I hope people have got something out of it. Thank you so much for watching. Do check out the Patreon if you are interested in those kinds of things, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.